Once upon a time, long, long ago, so long ago that no one's quite sure if it really happened or not. In the middle of the wood was the prettiest house you can imagine. It wasn't a palace, but it was very grand. It was furnished with the finest, most beautiful things, and a rather peculiar man, an air pitcher, lived there. Now, around abouts, people were said that he was a warlock and he should be avoided. And he definitely avoided the people around there, and they all kept their distance. Now, he had reached an age a long time before when he felt he was in need of a wife, but he had peculiar habits and he'd heard peculiar stories, and he felt that he needed a wife who would do what she was told and could be trusted. And he'd been told that such wives were hard to come by. I'm just going to put some wood on the fire. I'm getting quite cold here. So he'd been told that finding a trustworthy wife who would do what she was told was a difficult thing. He also knew that once he'd found a woman that he was to marry and had promised to marry her, then there'd be an ebbing and a flowing of the powers, and he would no longer necessarily be the dominant one, so he had to be able to trust her. Now, we've all got our little hobbies, and some of them are worse than others. And air pitchers, little peccadillos, were truly disgusting. But he designed a little test to see whether the women he found would be biddable and trustworthy, and if they failed the test, he was able to indulge his particular vice upon them. This way he didn't mind, and he could deal with the disappointment. Now, normally he traveled far away in his search for a beautiful virgin, for, well, it is well known that one should not shit in one's own backyard, and he didn't want any trouble, and if he left the people around him alone, they left him alone. But he couldn't help noticing 3 beautiful girls in the nearby village. Beautiful girl. And when he realized that the eldest was due to be married, and he could tell by her smell she was still a virgin, he thought he'd better pounce now. So he did his normal trick, dressed up as an aged beggarman with a big basket. He banged on the door. "I'm very hungry. Have you got a morsel of bread for an old man?" And of course, how could anyone refuse? And the eldest daughter gave him a great hunk of bread. "Oh, thank you." And he leant out with his hand, and he touched her hand. And in that instant, she became light as a feather, and he just picked her up and plonked her in his basket, put a cloth over the top, and took her home. Now, once she was in his house, he was charm itself, dressed very elegantly, and he presented her with a beautiful pearl necklace and diamonds and jewels beyond measure, and was very polite, and explained that he was looking for a wife, and that he gave her a bedroom with its own key, and didn't touch her, and flattered her and fed her beautiful things. And he had some musical instruments that played by themselves, and he was a very good dancer. And, well, I will only say this, that she enjoyed herself, and even though he was old and smelt a little bit, and there was certainly something a little bit odd about him, and it really wasn't the way she was used to being courted, and yes, she did have someone else she was supposed to be marrying, but at the same time, well, who doesn't want to live like a princess in a fairy tale? Once she got comfortable, Herr Fitcher thought it was time for the little test. So he said, well, my dear, I'm going away now for a few days, so I'm going to leave you in charge of the house. I will protect the house in a certain way so that no one can leave and no one can come in. So you shouldn't be worried. And of course, there's always food in the kitchen. It's always there. It's always ready. Whatever you want, you just, say it and it appears. But I have two favors to ask of you. First of all, you must please look after this egg, which is so very, very precious to me. If anything happens to it, well, you won't. So you just look after it and don't leave it for a second. And then these are the keys to the house. You can go into every room, but on the top floor, there is a small black door at the end of the corridor. You must not go into that door, and if you do go into that door, I'll have to kill you. He laughed, and she laughed too, though she wasn't entirely sure whether he was joking. But anyway, she wasn't going to go into that door. She'd read the fairy tales. She knew she was no fool. But after a few days, well, she did go through every room and every cupboard, and well, to cut a long story short, she thought she could just have a little peek to see what was in the room. It couldn't hurt, could it? No one would ever know. So, holding the egg ever so carefully in her hand to make sure nothing happened to it, she opened the door, dropped the egg, and screamed. What she saw, well, it was like the inside of a butcher's shop. There were great wooden tables and steel knives, and there were hooks with great slabs of meat hanging from them, fresh meat, except it wasn't animal meat, it was human meat. The room was full of chopped up girls, torsos here, heads there, legs there, and blood. Well, she closed the door, and she tried to pick up the egg, but it was smashed in a million pieces. There was nothing she could do. She went downstairs, and she cried for 2 days. Hello, how are you? How's my egg? She didn't answer. How is my egg? Is it broken? It is broken. And you looked inside the room, didn't you? Well, as you broke my egg, and as you opened that room you weren't allowed to open, you must now go into that room. Come on, off we go. With no will of her own, the poor girl led him up the stairs and along the corridor and opened that door. I'm not going to tell you the disgusting things that he did with her body, both before and after he chopped it up. But I think he enjoyed it. Then, well, of course he had to go back for the next sister, didn't he? And the same thing happened, the charm and the nice time, and off he went. And she wasn't going to go to that door. But of course, well, she thought she'd put the egg down first when she opened the door, and she really couldn't sort of, resist it. And the key sort of led her. She felt as the key was really pulling her towards the door, and the key sort of went into the door. And the door opened and she walked in before she knew what was happening. And she saw her sister and she saw everyone else. And she fled, closing the door behind her. But when she got down to the hall, the entrance hall of the house, she saw that behind her was a trail of bloody footsteps. She spent the next 2 days scrubbing and scrubbing and scrubbing, but the blood seemed to have stained the marble. Hello, my dear. How are you? How's my egg? You went into my room, you naughty, naughty girl, you naughty girl. Well, as you went into my room without my permission, you now have my permission to go there. In fact, you have well, I'm not going to, I'm afraid what happened. Now, the youngest girl, I don't want to say that the youngest girls are always the cleverest, but anyone out there who knows a younger sister, or well, perhaps I'd be put it another way, any younger sisters out there will know that they are the cleverest. So when her turn came, she too made sure the egg was safe. But she was also very, very careful. So when the door opened, she didn't go in. And she saw her sisters all chopped up. And she went off and she got some slippers and spare clothes. And she tiptoed in, and she couldn't really help herself. She was so horrified. But she sort of, almost without thinking, she started she knew it was her sister's foot, and she started looking for her sister's leg, and then she sort of put it on the table. And, well, a very strange thing happened. She sort of put the foot next to the end of the leg, and it sort of joined on. And she started getting the rest of the parts of her sisters and putting them together. And, well, if it was the wrong part, it didn't join. But when she knew it was the right bit, the right sister, because it would just miraculously sort of join and form. And finally, when she put the heads on, they came to life. What about the egg? Said the first one. I've got the egg. Don't worry, it's safe. Yes, but the bloody footprints. Don't leave if you're going to leave bloody footprints. Well, she took the two sisters out very carefully with slippers on, and she hid them in a room. And when Herr Fitcher returned, "Where's my egg? Here it is." There was no sign of blood, no broken egg. Let's give him credit. He was pleased. He'd finally found a woman that he could marry, that could be trusted to do what she was told. And he told her this. And in telling her this, well, some of his power began to ebb towards her. Yes, she said she would marry him, but he needed to get her father's permission first. And what she suggested was that she would get the house ready. They'd do the invitations first, and he would then take the invitations and a great basket full of gold to her father to ask for his permission. And then, well, then, after he'd got the permission, he could return with all his friends to the party, and they'd get married and live happily ever after. Well, Herr Fitcher, thought this was a most excellent idea. But what she did was, rather than filling the basket with gold, was get her two sisters in it and tie the top on very firmly. And then she told Herr Pitcher, "Now, when you go now and you go to my father's house, you don't stop once, don't put the basket down till you get there. I'm going to be watching. I'm going to be watching from the top window. So don't you dare sit down for one instant." Now, Herr Pitcher didn't really think much of this. He didn't like the idea of being told and bossed about, but there again, he did want to get married, and he had given his word. So off he went with this heavy basket. Maybe it got a bit too, I thought, well, very well, he didn't mind giving his father-in-law a present, but it did feel like it was awfully heavy. Perhaps it had a bit too much gold. He should sit down and sort of count it. But when he sort of tried to sit down, he heard his intended's voice. "Don't sit down, keep going." He thought he was out of sight. Of course, he was out of sight. It was just one of the sisters in the basket shouting out. But every time he tried to stop on the way, "Don't sit down, keep going." Well, he got to the father's house and said his bit and left the basket. And of course, after he'd gone, the sisters climbed out the basket, and, well, they told the story, and immediately the father went to the magistrate, and they gathered together a great posse and a priest and set off. Meanwhile, Herr Fitcher had gathered together all his friends and was going in great happiness and jolliment towards the house for the party. His betrothed, in the meantime, got a human skull and dolled it up to look all pretty, looking out from the top window. And then she got a barrel of honey and jumped into it naked. She got out of the barrel of honey, cut open a great eider down, and rolled around so she was covered in feathers like some sort of strange bird creature. And she ran out down the path. And as she bumped into Herr Pitcher's friends on the way, they said, "Well, what's happening? What's happening? Oh, the wedding party. Squawk, squawk, squawk. The wedding party is ready. Go in, make yourself at home. Herr Pitcher is coming." And then she saw Herr Fitcher himself, and Herr Fitcher didn't recognize this great bird. "What's happening, great bird?" said the warlock. "Oh, there's a wedding party, and your intended is looking out of the window." Well, he saw this rather gaunt face, but it was definitely a face looking out of the window, and he was quite happy and went along. She then ran into the magistrate and the posse, and she went with them. And when Herr Fitcher and all his friends were in the house, they took a flask of holy water and they made a circle around the outside of the house. And then they called out, "Those of you who are human, those of you who serve the true God, you may leave." Now, there was a lot of anxious talking, and a few people came out, but none of them could cross the circle of holy water. Well, the group, they set fire to the house, and it burnt down, and everybody in the house died. A horrible, horrible death. But everybody else lived happily ever after. Well, 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 children. I hope you're all tucked up in bed. You're all comfortable and cozy. You've all got your lights turned off. You've all got your eyes closed. You're breathing deeply. And you're all asleep. Oh, you look so very, very beautiful when you're sleeping. Night, night. Good night, all. Sleep well.